History is often remembered through its triumphs and tragedies, through great battles and grand monuments. But behind the glittering crowns, the soaring cathedrals, and the stories etched into legend, there lies another layer, one filled with scandal, mystery, and unexpected twists that still captivate us centuries later. Imagine kings who ruled vast empires but couldn't rule their own desires, men crowned with divine authority, yet remembered for chaos, betrayals, and personal indulgence. From England to France to Spain, medieval and early modern monarchs left behind stories that sound less like dry history and more like dramatic tales. Their courts became theaters of power games, whispered secrets, and forbidden romances. Some were remembered as tyrants, others as visionaries, but all of them were human, flawed, and unforgettable. Then, shift your gaze to one of the most mysterious brotherhoods of the Middle Ages, the Knights Templar. Founded to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, they grew into one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in history, their influence stretching from the battlefield to the royal treasury. Their sudden downfall in 1307 remains one of history's most chilling turning points. Even today, their name is wrapped in myth, sparking questions about what they truly protected and what secrets may have been lost when their order was crushed. But history is not only about kings and knights. It is also about the places that stood as silent witnesses to centuries of change. Few landmarks embody this more than Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris. Born from the genius of Gothic architecture in the 12th century, it became a symbol of hope, resilience, and the creative spirit of an entire civilization. It has survived revolutions, wars, and even near destruction, only to rise again through restoration and devotion. Every stone in its walls whispers stories of faith, struggle, and rebirth. And beyond Europe's crowns and cathedrals lies a story many never hear a tale from the seas of Asia. Imagine a woman who defied every expectation of her time, commanding not just a ship, but an entire fleet, feared across the oceans. Jung Yi Sao, known in the West as Qing Shi, transformed from a widow into one of the most formidable pirate leaders in history. With sharp strategy and unshakable authority, she ruled her fleet through strict codes of conduct, negotiated with empires, and retired undefeated. Her name may not appear in every textbook, but her legacy is too extraordinary to ignore. Together, these stories remind us that history is not only a record of dates and names, it is a tapestry of human ambition, courage, flaws, and resilience. Tonight, as you listen, allow yourself to step into the forgotten corridors of time, where secrets whisper and legends linger. If you enjoy uncovering history's hidden side, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel for more journeys into the past. Your support helps keep these stories alive, bringing forgotten voices and lost worlds back into the light. As we turn the page from the grandeur of cathedrals and the high seas of legendary pirates, our gaze falls upon a throne much closer to home. In the heart of medieval England, where one of the most infamous monarchs of the era held court. King John, a man whose very name evokes suspicion and scandal, ascended to the English throne in 1199 under circumstances that might have seemed ordinary to the untrained eye. Royal succession following the death of his older brother, Richard the Lionheart. But nothing about John's reign was ever ordinary. From the very beginning, he struggled to command the loyalty of his nobles. His trust he squandered through a mixture of arrogance, impulsiveness, and decisions that often seemed motivated more by personal whim than the careful management of a kingdom. John's reign was marked by a series of conflicts, both foreign and domestic, yet it was his personal conduct, intertwined with his political failures, that secured his lasting reputation as one of England's most controversial kings. Historians often point to the chronic distrust that colored every corner of his rule, noting that even the most loyal courtiers approached him with caution, wary of his temper and unpredictable judgment. Yet, what makes John particularly fascinating and, at times, Almost tragic is the way in which his private life seemed to echo the chaos of his public reign. Rumors swirled throughout the court of children, whose very existence was shrouded in secrecy. Illegitimate offspring that may have wandered the halls of castles and manor houses unbeknownst to their rightful heirs, creating webs of intrigue and whispered speculation that would have rivaled the plots of any modern drama. These stories, passed down in chronicles and letters, suggest a man who was deeply human in his desires, yet remarkably reckless in how he allowed those desires to intersect with the machinery of power. Perhaps the most telling detail of John's tumultuous tenure is not a single battle lost or a treaty broken, but the profound erosion of trust that followed him like a shadow across the kingdom. A king who could not even secure the affection or respect of his closest allies was doomed to leave behind a realm fractured by doubt and resentment. A kingdom in which the seeds of rebellion and dissatisfaction were sown deeply enough to shape the future of English governance in ways he could never have foreseen. And yet, in contemplating John's story, there is an odd mixture of incredulity and dark amusement. For while his failures were monumental and his reputation dreadful, he also embodies a kind of human contradiction that makes history feel alive. The man who wielded a crown with the authority of a sovereign, yet fumbled it through temper and folly, whose personal entanglements could inspire scandal, paranoia, and whispered gossip for generations to come, and whose very missteps eventually contributed to the creation of mechanisms like Magna Carta, the document that sought to curb the excesses of kings and lay down the foundation for principles of accountability and law that resonate even today. In this way, King John stands as both a cautionary tale and an essential figure, a reminder that even in the midst of misrule and personal scandal, the ripples of one king's failings can reshape the course of an entire nation, leaving behind stories that continue to intrigue, confound, and captivate those willing to explore the darker corners of history. As the echoes of King John's turbulent reign fade into the shadows of England's medieval past, our journey across time and geography brings us to the opulent, yet perilous halls of France, where the crown rested upon the brow of Charles VI, a monarch whose life and reign are remembered as a complex tapestry woven from brilliance, tragedy, and profound instability, earning him the haunting epithet, the Mad. Born into a kingdom brimming with wealth, culture, and a growing sense of national identity, Charles ascended to the French throne as a young man, his early years marked by promise and expectation that he would guide his country toward glory and stability. Yet, beneath the veneer of youthful ambition and regal ceremony, there lurked a fragility in Charles' mind, a vulnerability that would come to define both his personal life and the fate of France itself. Unlike kings, whose authority is measured by military triumphs or territorial expansion, Charles' legacy is inextricably linked to the unpredictability of his own consciousness, and the court soon learned that the man who held the scepter could at times be as mercurial and dangerous as the forces of war surrounding his kingdom. From the outset, the signs of mental strain became apparent as episodes of paranoia, hallucination, and erratic behavior began to punctuate the rhythms of court life, leaving advisors and nobles perpetually uncertain whether they were witnessing a ruler at the height of strategy or a sovereign slipping into incomprehensible delusion. One can almost imagine the grand halls of the Palais de la, where courtiers tread lightly, their whispers filling the air like shadows. And yet, beneath the opulence, there was a sense of tension so thick it seemed to press against the tapestries and frescoes themselves, as if the very walls of the palace absorbed and reflected the king's instability. Amid these personal struggles, Charles' reign was punctuated by a series of scandals that would have left any observer questioning the boundary between history and legend. Marriages arranged for political gain became fraught with suspicion. Alliances shifted unpredictably. The court became a stage upon which not only power, but the fragility of a monarch's mind played out in public view. Nobles, often caught between loyalty and self-preservation, navigated a maze of favors, betrayals, and uncertain commands, understanding that the king's favor might be granted one day and rescinded the next, sometimes in ways that defied reason or explanation. Yet, despite or perhaps because of this volatility, Charles' story captivates us centuries later, for it presents a portrait of a man whose humanity, however compromised, was undeniable. He was capable of deep empathy, genuine cultural patronage, and the kind of charisma that could inspire devotion. Yet, he was equally capable of fits of terror, obsessive fear of imagined enemies, and decisions that plunged his kingdom into chaos. The wars waged on French soil during his reign, compounded by internal strife among factions vying for influence over a monarch whose own judgment was often clouded, created a climate in which both heroism and tragedy could emerge, sometimes within the same breath. His reign, therefore, reads less like a linear narrative of kingship and more like a living document of the human psyche under pressure, illustrating how the burdens of power, combined with the frailties of mind, can ripple outward to shape a nation's destiny in ways both subtle and catastrophic. Charles VI, the Mad, remains a figure whose life challenges our understanding of rulership, mental illness, and the delicate balance between public duty and private struggle, reminding us that even within gilded halls and sumptuous ceremonies, history is written not only in victories and treaties, but in the fragile, complex, and often unpredictable humanity of those who wear the crown. As the turbulent reign of Charles VI casts its long shadow over the French crown, we now travel southward to the sun-scorched plains and fortified cities of medieval Spain, where Peter of Castile, a monarch whose very existence seems to blur the line between legend and nightmare, held court with a ferocity that both captivated and terrified his subjects. Known to history as the Cruel, Peter ruled in the mid-14th century with a combination of dazzling intelligence and an unpredictability that left allies and enemies alike constantly on edge. For his brilliance and statecraft was matched only by his readiness to wield violence, whether in the name of political necessity or personal desire. Unlike kings whose reputations were shaped by measured diplomacy or the careful cultivation of alliances, Peter's life and reign read like a chronicle of extremes, where love and hate, loyalty and betrayal, ambition and bloodshed were inseparably intertwined, creating a court in which nothing was certain except the king's capacity for both charm and cruelty. From the moment he assumed the throne, Peter's presence was impossible to ignore. His charisma drew followers with magnetic intensity, even as his unpredictability instilled fear, a duality that defined his rule. His political maneuvering was both ingenious and ruthless, involving betrayals of former allies, sudden executions of those who displeased him, and a mastery of intrigue so complete that one could scarcely tell friend from foe within the ever-shifting landscape of Castilian nobility. Yet, it was not only politics in which Peter's extremity manifested. His personal relationships were equally dramatic, often bordering on obsession, and sometimes spilling into violence. Tales of his court whisper that those who failed to meet his desires, or who were perceived as rivals, even in matters of the heart, could disappear from the royal radar permanently, leaving their fates to the shadows of rumor and fear. This intertwining of love and cruelty created an atmosphere in which romance itself seemed a battlefield, with every gesture, glance, or whispered word carrying consequences as weighty as any treaty signed or war declared. What makes Peter especially compelling, even to modern audiences, is this blending of contradiction. He could inspire loyalty in his generals and ministers, who often marveled at his sharp intellect and strategic acumen. And yet, those same individuals lived under the constant threat of sudden execution or humiliation if he perceived a slight or imagined disloyalty. His court was a place where opulence and terror coexisted. Sumptuous feasts, grand tournaments, and elaborate ceremonies could erupt into scenes of shocking brutality, leaving courtiers to navigate the precarious line between survival and favor. In this way, Peter's reign becomes a lens through which we see the delicate balance of medieval power, where charisma, fear, and violence were often inseparable, and where a single misstep or a moment of perceived insolence could alter the course of one's life forever. Yet, even amidst these shadows, Peter's story remains fascinating, not simply because of his cruelty, but because it illustrates the human capacity for extremity in both thought and action, the ways in which power magnifies both virtue and vice, and the consequences that ripple outward when a ruler allows personal passions to dictate the fates of nations. In Peter of Castile, we see a monarch whose legacy is defined by contrast, brilliant and terrifying, charming and deadly. A ruler whose life reminds us that history's most enduring stories often emerge not from the mundane or ordinary, but from the extraordinary collision of personality, ambition, and the relentless demands of power. As the fiery courts of Castile recede into memory, we return once more to the misted landscapes of England, where the story of Edward II unfolds with a mixture of tragedy, controversy, and human vulnerability, a tale that echoes across centuries, not only for its political consequences, but also for the deeply personal nature of the king's choices and attachments. Ascending to the throne in 1307, Edward inherited a kingdom still recovering from the ambitions and victories of his forebears. Yet, it soon became clear that the challenges awaiting him were as much internal as external, and that his reign would be defined as much by personal relationships as by battles or proclamations. History remembers Edward most immediately for two intertwined legacies: the shocking defeat at the Battle of Bannockburn, which left Scotland unbowed and England reeling, and his conspicuous favoritism towards certain male companions, a favoritism that inflamed political tensions, provoked resentment among nobles, and became the subject of whispers and scandal that would linger long after his reign ended. To witness Edward II's court is to enter a world where loyalty and influence were inseparable from personal intimacy, where a king's affections could alter alliances, reward some, and punish others, and where the exercise of power was inseparably entwined with the private and the emotional. His most famous companion, Piers Gaveston, quickly became a figure of fascination and resentment alike, a man whose presence at Edward's side drew both admiration and outrage, for in him were concentrated all the privileges and the danger of the king's favor, lavish gifts, prominent titles, and influence that many nobles felt rightly belonged to themselves or to the crown in its impartial majesty. The intensity of Edward's attachment to Gaveston was more than a matter of friendship or personal trust. It became a political force that reshaped courtly alliances and stirred rebellion, demonstrating that the passions of a single individual could reverberate through the structures of power with consequences as far-reaching as any army in the field. Meanwhile, the kingdom itself bore the strain of these entanglements. Bannockburn in 1314 stands as a stark testament to the vulnerability of a monarch whose focus could be divided, whose energies were as often consumed by courtly intrigue as by the demands of military leadership. The defeat was catastrophic, leaving England's northern territories exposed, its military reputation tarnished, and the king's judgment questioned at every level. Yet Edward's personal narrative is inseparable from these events, for it is impossible to separate the man from the monarch, the private longing from the public duty, or the affection for one favorite companion from the simmering resentment it engendered among others. His reign, in short, simplifies the profound tension inherent in human leadership. The desire for personal connection, recognition, and loyalty can both elevate and imperil, inspire devotion and provoke betrayal, and, in Edward's case, create a historical memory that is as human as it is cautionary. Through the lens of Edward II, we witness the fragility of kingship when human emotion and political power collide, when the personal becomes inseparable from the political, when a monarch's heart, desires, and attachments can shape the destiny of an entire nation, leaving behind a legacy as poignant and conflicted as any tragedy written on the annals of history. Edward II's life is a reminder that the burdens of leadership are never borne in isolation, and that even the most exalted throne cannot insulate a man from the consequences of his passions, choices, and affections, a lesson both timeless and profoundly human. As the stormy courts of England recede into memory, we journey eastward to the heart of Bohemia, where the tale of Wenceslas unfolds like a cautionary fable of unchecked indulgence and mismanaged power, a story in which the title of king carried little weight against a vivid spectacle of human folly. Ascending the throne in the late 14th century, Wenceslas inherited not only a crown, but the complex machinery of governance, a kingdom requiring steady hands and keen judgment to navigate the turbulent currents of medieval politics. Yet, history would remember him less for legislation or diplomacy than for a penchant for excess that turned the palace into a theater of chaos. Tales from the time paint a vivid portrait of a monarch more notorious for his indulgence in wine, its casual disregard of decorum, spontaneous outbursts that sometimes erupted into physical altercations within the very halls meant to symbolize order and authority. Courtiers and visitors alike whispered about the king's habit of wandering palace corridors in various states of undress, his laughter echoing off the stone walls in ways that suggested a man simultaneously charming, dangerous, and unpredictable, whose focus on ruling a kingdom was eclipsed by the immediacy of his pleasures and the theatrics of his temperament. Yet, beneath the absurdity and the scandal, Wenceslas' reign offers a window into the fragile nature of authority when the human element, the appetites, fears, and whims of a ruler is allowed free rein, unmoderated by counsel or restraint. While other monarchs wielded their crowns with calculated ambition or deliberate cruelty, Wenceslas wielded his presence as both spectacle and provocation, leaving those around him to navigate a court that was equal parts amusement park and minefield, where no conversation, no gathering, and no ceremonial procession was entirely predictable. The king's drunken escapades, spontaneous disputes, and occasional public nudity became emblematic, not only of personal excess, but of the broader instability that can emerge when leadership is left to personal whim, demonstrating in living color that the behavior of one individual, especially one clothed in symbolic authority, can ripple outward to affect the morale, cohesion, and perception of an entire realm. And yet, there is a strange fascination in Wenceslas' story, for amid the revelry and disorder, glimpses of human vulnerability emerge, hinting at a man who perhaps struggled with the expectations of kingship, who sought diversion and validation and pleasures that seemed, at least momentarily, to fill the yawning gap between duty and desire. His reign, though remembered in anecdote and rumor more than in legislative achievement or military conquest, reminds us that the spectacle of power is inseparable from the human story, that even the loftiest title cannot insulate one from folly, and that the line between legend and reality is often defined by the stories left behind in whispered corridors, chroniclers' ink, and the imaginations of posterity. Wenceslas of Bohemia, a king whose legacy is defined as much by laughter, mischief, and scandal as by any act of governance, serves as a compelling mirror to the enduring truth that the crown magnifies not only authority but also human weakness, leaving a history that is as vivid and cautionary as it is unforgettable. As the misadventures of Bohemia fade into history's tapestry, we return once again to England, this time to a kingdom on the cusp of transformation, where the larger-than-life figure of Henry VIII emerges not merely as a monarch, but as a force of cultural, religious, and personal upheaval, whose name still resonates with intrigue and fascination centuries later. Ascending to the throne in 1509, as a young man brimming with charm, athleticism, and ambition, Henry seemed destined to embody the ideal of kingship, commanding, intelligent, and capable of inspiring both admiration and loyalty. Yet beneath the glittering surface of tournament triumphs, lavish feasts, and dazzling pageantry lay a tempest of personal passions and political convictions that would shape the course of English history in ways both revolutionary and scandalous. While he's remembered by posterity for his 6 marriages, frequent divorces, and the seismic break with Rome that established the Church of England, Henry's story is far richer. A tangled web of ambition, artistry, desire, taste, and the relentless assertion of authority in both private chambers and public affairs. From the outset, Henry's life was a study in contrasts, a monarch whose court overflowed with intellectual vibrancy, musical innovation, and architectural grandeur, yet also a man capable of capricious cruelty, profound jealousy, and decisions that would leave both family and kingdom reeling. His marriages, each infused with political calculation, as well as personal passion, became public spectacles of devotion, betrayal, and scandal, capturing the imagination of courtiers and commoners alike. Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, endured decades of devotion and ultimately rejection, a union that would ignite a religious revolution. Anne Boleyn, ambitious and astute, rose to heights of influence only to fall victim to the same ruthless mechanisms of court intrigue and royal caprice that Henry wielded as both tool and weapon. Each marriage, each divorce, and each execution left its mark not merely on Henry's conscience or legacy, but on the very fabric of English society, shaping legal precedent, religious identity, and the expectations placed upon monarchs for generations to come. Yet Henry was far from merely a figure of domestic scandal. He was also a transformative patron of the arts, architecture, and learning. Under his reign, England's courts became centers of humanist thought and artistic innovation, where painters, composers, and architects flourished under royal patronage. The grandeur of palaces, the intricacy of tapestries, and the brilliance of literary works all bear his unmistakable imprint, revealing a monarch who could balance, at least at times, the worlds of creativity and authority with the same decisiveness that characterized his political maneuverings. And yet, the tension between personal desire and public duty remained ever present, as the same man who could commission magnificent works of art could also order the execution of a trusted advisor or former companion, leaving a kingdom simultaneously enriched and terrified by the magnitude of his presence. Ultimately, Henry VIII's reign stands as a testament to the inseparability of genius and chaos, ambition and indulgence, love and destruction. He reshaped England not only through legislation and conquest, but also through the personal drama of his marriages and the radical redefinition of religious authority. His story reminds us that the life of a monarch is never confined to policy or ceremony. It is lived in the intersections of passion, artistry, power, and human fallibility, and that those intersections, when magnified by the scale of kingship, can leave a legacy as magnificent as it is cautionary, as inspiring as it is unsettling, a tale whose echoes continue to fascinate and captivate the imagination of all who look back upon the Tudor throne, as the turbulent and transformative reign of Henry VIII recedes into the annals of Tudor history. Our journey leads us across the Channel to France, to the dazzling court of Francis I, monarch whose life sparkles with the brilliance of the Renaissance, yet pulses with the energy, passion, and occasional scandal of a man who understood that the exercise of power extended far beyond treaties and battles, reaching deep into the realm of human desire, artistic vision, and the subtle theatrics of courtly life. Ascending to the French throne in 1515, Francis arrived as a young, charismatic, and ambitious king, determined to position France at the forefront of European culture, politics, and military might, yet equally determined to enjoy the pleasures, seductions, and seductions of a court that he turned into both a stage and a playground, where the drama of love, loyalty, and intrigue was performed with the same intensity and precision as any military campaign. Unlike many monarchs whose legacies are measured solely in conquests or decrees, France's influence radiated through art, literature, architecture, in the very atmosphere of the royal court, transforming it into a vibrant center of intellectual exchange and romantic spectacle, a place where beauty and ambition collided, and where the king's magnetism was felt in every corridor, gallery, and ballroom. Francis' patronage of the Renaissance is legendary, for he understood the power of culture not merely as ornamentation, but as a reflection of political strength and personal vision. He invited artists like Leonardo da Vinci to France, commissioned grand chateaux that would endure for centuries, and surrounded himself with poets, scholars, and philosophers who would shape the intellectual and aesthetic landscape of Europe. Just as his court flourished with creativity and sophistication, it also became infamous for a kind of orchestrated romantic chaos, where the king's appetites and charisma dictated the social currents of the court, and where nobles and ladies alike navigated an intricate dance of favor, flirtation, and ambition. His relationships with women were the subject of whispered gossip, scandalous speculation, and, occasionally, public intrigue. As Francis seemed to approach romance with the same strategic eye he brought to war, carefully balancing passion, charm, the cultivation of loyalty to ensure that his court remained both enchanted and under his control. In many ways, Francis I exemplifies the duality of Renaissance monarchy, a ruler capable of elevating culture, art, and thought to unprecedented heights, simultaneously indulging the whims, desires, and theatrics of personal passion with abandon. The court of Francis was a living tapestry of influence, beauty, and human complexity, a place where political alliances intertwined with romance, where art and ambition moved in tandem, and where every banquet, dance, or hunt carried the potential for both delight and scandal. His life reminds us that the allure of power is inseparable from the magnetism of personality, that the legacy of a king is as much shaped by the vibrancy of his court and the indulgences of his passions as by the edicts he issues or the battles he wins, and that history often remembers not just the victories and the conquests, but the brilliance, charisma, and humanity of those who wield power with both daring and flair. Francis I, the Renaissance king, leaves behind a story that is intoxicating in its complexity, a monarch whose love of beauty, art, and romance transformed France, whose appetite for life turned his court into a stage of endless intrigue, and whose legacy endures as a reminder that power, culture, and desire are forever intertwined, painting a portrait of kingship that is as radiant, intricate, and compelling as the chateau paintings and poetry he so loved to surround himself with. As the brilliant lights and intricate romances of Francis I's court fade into memory, we descend into the shadowed corridors of other European courts, where the wielding of power often mingled with personal indulgence, and where the lives of kings were as deeply intertwined with intrigue, desire, and secrecy as they were with legislation or conquest. In Castile, Alonso's reign stands out as a prime example of how private passions could shape public authority, with the king's obsession with his mistress. Quinor was no mere dalliance, but a carefully orchestrated affair that shifted the balance of influence within the palace itself, elevating her to a status that rivaled the queen, dictating policy behind the throne, and demonstrating how the lines between love, obsession, and governance could blur in ways both fascinating and dangerous. Leonor, sharp, ambitious, and politically astute, became not just a companion, but a power broker, guiding court decisions and ensuring that Alonso's affection translated into authority, wealth, and influence for herself and her allies, leaving the legitimate queen, Maria, to occupy a ceremonial role as the public face of monarchy, while the real power quietly flowed through private chambers and secret corridors. Across Europe, similar dynamics unfolded under Charles II and Ferdinand, whose courts became arenas of both political maneuvering and personal spectacle, where mistresses were more than companions. They were central actors in a delicate and often ruthless theater of influence, Secret passageways, hidden rooms, and discreet housing were constructed to facilitate liaisons while keeping public appearances intact. A testament to the ingenuity, ambition, and sometimes absurd lengths to which monarchs would go to satisfy both desire and authority. Illegitimate children, often quietly endowed with titles, land, and privilege, emerged as additional players in this intricate game. Their existence, a constant reminder that dynastic strategy and personal indulgence were never truly separate, and that a single whispered rumor or misstep could ripple through a kingdom, altering alliances and provoking scandal. Ferdinand's court, in particular, illustrates the precarious balance of power and personal indulgence, as his attentions shifted fluidly between queens, noble women, and favored companions, creating layers of intrigue that required constant negotiation, observation, and subtlety from every courtier. In such environments, loyalty was rarely absolute, and survival demanded an acute understanding of both human desire and political strategy. For one could gain favor in the morning, only to fall from grace by evening. And where the corridors of castles and palaces often concealed as much danger as the battlefields beyond, the allure of power in these courts was inseparable from the spectacle of romance, the management of reputation, and the perpetual negotiation of authority, making the lives of rulers like Alonso, Charles II, and Ferdinand compelling examples of how human passions can influence not only the private chambers, but also the very machinery of government itself. In the end, these stories remind us that monarchs were never merely rulers in the abstract. They were humans whose desires, obsessions, and relationships profoundly shaped the destiny of their realms. Courts, dominated by mistresses, secret corridors, the careful orchestration of personal influence serve as enduring examples of how the intimate and the political can collide with breathtaking effect, leaving behind histories rich in drama, scandal, and intrigue. From the shadowed halls of Castile to the opulent yet perilous courts of France, Spain, and beyond, the interplay of desire, secrecy, and ambition illustrates a timeless truth. The human element, its passions, its weaknesses, and cunning is often the most powerful force of all, capable of guiding kingdoms toward glory or disaster in ways that decrees and armies alone could never achieve. As the glittering courts of Europe recede into the shadows of history, another kind of power emerges on the horizon. One defined not by personal indulgence or romantic intrigue, but by a rigid devotion to faith, discipline, and martial skill. The rise of the Knights Templar, an order whose story would intertwine with kings, popes, and empires in ways both awe-inspiring and tragic. Founded in the early 12th century with the blessing of the Church and the guidance of figures like Bernard of Clairvaux, the Templars were charged with a singular, sacred mission to protect pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, ensuring that those journeying across deserts, mountains, and hostile territories could reach Jerusalem in safety. What began as a small brotherhood of knights, clad in simple white mantles emblazoned with the Red Cross, would quickly grow into a force whose reputation, discipline, and wealth rivaled that of the most powerful monarchs in Christendom. A development that would soon blur the line between devotion and influence in ways few could have anticipated. The allure of the Templars lay not only in their military prowess, but in the sense of purpose and unity that bound them together, creating an order that was both fiercely loyal and singularly focused. These men were not merely soldiers, They were monks, bound by vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty, yet empowered to wield sword and shield in the defense of pilgrims and Christian territories. Their ceremonies were steeped in secrecy, their hierarchy rigorous, and their discipline absolute. A combination that allowed them to operate as a sovereign entity within a world dominated by kings, princes, and bishops. In many respects, they were untouchable. No ordinary monarch could command them, no noble could bribe them, and only the Grand Master, chosen from among their own ranks, could issue orders that dictated life, death, or action on the battlefield. Toting witness, a Templar in armor, was to glimpse a fusion of spirituality and martial skill. An individual whose life was devoted entirely to a cause greater than personal gain. It's a symbol of both devotion and fear across Europe and beyond. Yet, the Templars' rise was not without consequence. As their wealth, influence, and mystique grew, so too did the unease of rulers who had once welcomed their protection. Kings owed them fortunes, relied upon their armies, and benefited from their administrative acumen. Yet the very independence that made the Templars so formidable also made them dangerous in the eyes of those who sought to consolidate power. Rumors of secretive rituals, hidden treasures, obtained untold riches began to circulate. And what had started as a mission to defend the faithful gradually became an institution whose wealth, discipline, and autonomy provoked envy, fear, and political maneuvering at the highest levels. The Templars, once defenders of pilgrims, now existed in a precarious space between reverence and suspicion, admired as warriors of God, while simultaneously scrutinized as men whose power could rival kings themselves, setting the stage for a dramatic collision between piety, ambition, and politics that would reverberate across centuries. In exploring the origins of the Knights Templar, we see not just the formation of a military order, but the embodiment of a paradox, that devotion, discipline, and faith can elevate a group to heights unmatched in both influence and legacy, yet also sow the seeds of envy, fear, and eventual downfall. Their story reminds us that power takes many forms, and that even the most seemingly holy of missions can ripple outward into realms of politics, intrigue, and human ambition, leaving a legacy as legendary as it is cautionary, a tale that begins with protection, faith, and purpose, but grows into a narrative that history will never forget. As the Knights Templar continued their sacred mission of protecting pilgrims and defending Christian territories, their influence expanded far beyond the battlefields and desert roads of the Holy Land, evolving into an institution whose reach extended into every corner of medieval Europe, quietly reshaping politics, commerce, and society in ways few could have imagined at the order's inception. The Templars' strict discipline, combined with their unique dual identity as both monks and warriors, allowed them not only to command respect on the battlefield, but also to manage resources, land holdings, and financial networks with remarkable efficiency. Castles, fortresses, and estates were acquired across France, England, Spain, and beyond, serving as both strategic bases and centers of economic activity, where skilled administrators oversaw everything from farming and taxation to banking and trade, turning the Templars into one of the wealthiest and most organized institutions of the medieval world. Their increasing wealth, however, brought with it an aura of mystery, for the Templars were as secretive as they were powerful. Ordinary people, and even kings themselves, knew little about the inner workings of the order, their rituals, or the true extent of their holdings. Rumors circulated of hidden treasures, secret knowledge, and ceremonial practices that combined the spiritual with the enigmatic, landing the Templars an almost mythic reputation, one that inspired both reverence and fear. They became not merely defenders of the faithful, but arbiters of influence, capable of negotiating with monarchs, guiding the movement of armies, and mediating disputes across kingdoms, their decisions shaped as much by strategic necessity as by devotion to their founding ideals. In an age when power was often exercised through displays of force, wealth, or lineage, the Templars demonstrated that secrecy and discipline could be equally formidable weapons, allowing them to wield authority without overt aggression, to command loyalty without coercion, and to exert influence across Europe with a subtlety that left observers both impressed and uneasy. It is this combination of wealth, discipline, and secrecy that transformed the Templars from a modest band of knights protecting pilgrims into a political and economic powerhouse that kings could neither fully control nor ignore. Monarchs relied on them for loans, military support, and the administration of estates. Yet, that same reliance fostered unease, for no earthly ruler could dictate the actions of the Templar order without risking conflict with both its leadership and the church. Their castles grew more imposing, their coffers more filled, and their network more extensive. The Templars became a symbol of how power can accumulate quietly, subtly, and irresistibly, proving that the greatest influence is often not shouted from the battlefield, but exercised in the shadows, through prudent management, careful alliances, and an unwavering commitment to their own code. By the early 14th century, Templars had become indispensable, yet simultaneously intimidating, their wealth and secrecy casting long shadows over European courts and kingdoms, planting seeds of envy and suspicion among those who sought dominion over all else. The stage was set for a dramatic reckoning, a collision between kings, popes, an order that had grown too powerful to ignore, and history would soon witness how devotion, discipline, cunning could both elevate and imperil even the most legendary of institutions, leaving a legacy whose echoes would resonate far beyond the medieval world, enduring as a story of ambition, mystery, and extraordinary human endeavor. As the Knights Templar's coffers swelled with wealth and their influence spread across kingdoms, a quiet unease began to take root in the hearts of monarchs. For these warrior monks were unlike any other institution of their time, sovereign in spirit, disciplined in action, and utterly independent in judgment. They operated beyond the reach of kings and princes, bound only to their own rules and, ultimately, to the authority of the Pope. The very independence that had allowed the Templars to flourish now cast long shadows over European courts. For rulers who once welcomed their protection and counted upon their loans and military support now found themselves unnerved by an order whose power could not be commanded, whose wealth could not be seized without consequence, and whose network of influence permeated every corner of Christendom. Ts owed to the Templars were not mere financial obligations. They were threads that connected monarchs to an entity whose loyalty could not be purchased, whose judgment could not be swayed by threats, and whose reach extended into the very heart of the medieval world, subtly shaping the politics, economies, and alliances of Europe with an authority that rivaled that of kings themselves. For rulers such as Philip IV of France, the Templars presented a paradox that was as dangerous as it was irresistible. They were indispensable allies in warfare and administration, yet simultaneously a looming threat to royal prerogative, a reminder that power need not reside solely on thrones or in armies, but could be cultivated quietly, meticulously, and independently. The very existence of an order whose coffers were brimming, while royal treasuries struggled to keep pace, was a source of envy and fear, a daily reminder that kings could not fully control the forces they had once welcomed, and that an institution devoted to piety and protection could become an instrument of influence beyond any monarch's command. The Templars' disciplined secrecy only heightened this tension. For every rumor of hidden treasure, ceremonial ritual, or clandestine decision-making seemed to underscore their untouchable status, creating an aura of power that, while founded on devotion and service, was now perceived as a direct challenge to the authority of those who sat upon Europe's thrones. In every court where Templar influence extended, whispers of caution circulated. Kings and nobles who had once patronized the order began to question whether wealth and loyalty could coexist with independence, whether devotion to God might obscure political ambition, and whether an institution designed to protect the faithful had, in fact, grown too powerful to be contained. The Templars' growing autonomy transformed them from allies into potential adversaries. And in the delicate calculus of medieval politics, perception often mattered as much as reality. Monarchs, who thrived on the certainty of command, could not ignore a force that operated according to its own rules, maintained its own armies, and commanded resources that exceeded even the most ambitious royal aspirations. What had begun as admiration and reliance gradually shifted into suspicion, envy, and fear, setting the stage for a confrontation that would forever alter the landscape of European power, proving that even the most revered institutions, when perceived as independent and untouchable, can inspire as much dread as they do respect. The simmering tension between monarchs and the Knights Templar reached its boiling point on a day that would echo through the centuries. October 13th, 1307. A date forever etched in history, not simply as a Friday, but as the day when fear, envy, and political calculation converged in a meticulously orchestrated act that would bring one of the most powerful institutions of medieval Christendom to its knees. At dawn, across the corners of France, armed agents of King Philip IV, known to history as Philip the Fair, moved with cold precision, descending upon Templar strongholds, castles, and commanderies in a synchronized sweep designed to ensure that no member of the order could escape the king's reach. Knights, who had spent their lives defending pilgrims, maintaining discipline, and upholding vows of piety, awoke not to the call of battle, but to the sharp clamor of accusation. Chains, coots, and the heavy footfalls of royal enforcers who had come not for negotiation, counsel, or tribute, but for submission, incarceration, and, ultimately, judgment by fire and fear. The arrests were not haphazard. They were the culmination of years of political maneuvering, financial grievances, and deep-rooted envy. For Philip IV's coffers had long been strained by war and ambition, and the Templars' vast wealth offered both temptation and justification. Accusations of heresy, blasphemy, secret rituals, and moral corruption were levied against the knights with a methodical ferocity. And despite the absence of evidence or substantiation in most cases, these charges became the pretext for what was, in effect, a royal purge. Across Europe, the sheer audacity of the operation sent shockwaves through courts and kingdoms. For an order that had once been untouchable, whose loyalty had been assumed unassailable, now found itself shackled and humiliated. Its members forced to face a world that had turned against them with a speed and ruthlessness that seemed almost theatrical in its precision. The psychological impact of that day cannot be overstated. Imagine, for a moment, the knights who had trained for decades in discipline, strategy, and the defense of the faithful, suddenly stripped of autonomy, accused of crimes that contradicted the very essence of their vows, and confined within darkened cells where rumor, fear, and despair festered alongside uncertainty about their fate. Families, allies, and kings who had once relied on them could do nothing, for the machinery of accusation and arrest was designed to isolate, destabilize, and terrify, leaving the Templars to confront the terrifying reality that their independence, the very quality that had made them formidable, was now the source of their undoing. Across the realm, the wheels of power had turned decisively against them, demonstrating that even the most disciplined, wealthy, and loyal institution could fall victim to the ambitions, insecurities, and calculated cruelty of mortal rulers, and that in the delicate interplay of politics, wealth, and perception, no legacy, no matter how sacred, was immune to the tides of fear and human ambition. October 13th, 1307, thus stands not merely as a date, but as a dramatic pivot in history, marking the point at which reverence for an order's courage and devotion was eclipsed by envy, debt, and political calculation, setting in motion a sequence of trials, confessions, scandalous, and executions that would forever redefine the relationship between church, monarchy, and military power, and leaving a story whose resonance of loyalty betrayed, power challenged, and legend ignited continues to captivate the imagination to this day. The unfolding tragedy of the Knights Templar reached its bitter conclusion in 1312. A culmination of relentless political pressure, manipulated accusations, and the inexorable ambition of King Philip IV, whose desire to control wealth and power had driven him to challenge an institution that had once seemed untouchable. By papal decree, the order was officially dissolved, stripping the Templars of their properties, titles, and any vestiges of legal recognition, while the Knights themselves, once celebrated as the defenders of Christendom, the guardians of pilgrims, and paragons of discipline, found themselves cast into a world that no longer recognized their service, devotion, or sacrifice. The leaders of the order, including the revered Grand Master Jacques de Molay, were subjected to show trials, coerced confessions, and, ultimately, executions that were intended as both punishment and warning. A grim spectacle designed to erase not only the power of the Templars, but the very memory of their influence and autonomy. Yet even as flames consumed bodies and ink-sealed decrees, the essence of the Templars refused to vanish into obscurity. For what could not be contained by fire or law found a new life in legend, in whispered tales of secret treasure, mystical rites, and a brotherhood whose courage and devotion had transcended the constraints of earthly power. Their story, though marred by betrayal and tragedy, became a canvas upon which imagination, speculation, and myth could flourish, and the narrative of the Templars transformed from the history of a disciplined, devout order into a tapestry of intrigue, mystery, and enduring fascination. Across Europe, castles, once filled with knights in white mantles, stood abandoned or repurposed, yet the symbols, architecture, and hidden passageways remained, subtle reminders of a force that had once shaped kingdoms and defied kings. Chronicles, written by contemporaries, often tinged with fear or resentment, preserved fragments of their deeds, while folklore and later romanticized accounts embellished the story, turning the Templars into a legendary brotherhood whose deeds, real and imagined, inspired awe and speculation for centuries. The executions of 1312, rather than erasing their memory, elevated it, casting the knights as tragic heroes, betrayed by earthly rulers, yet immortalized by the moral and symbolic power they had wielded, and ensuring that their legacy would endure not merely as a historical footnote, but as a symbol of courage, independence, and devotion that continues to capture the imagination even in modern times. In this way, the dissolution of the Knights Templar reminds us that power, while fragile in the face of politics and human ambition, cannot completely erase honor, discipline, or legend, for the stories of those who live by purpose and conviction persist far beyond the reach of fire, decree, or betrayal, and in the case of the Templars, their myth became far larger, more mysterious, and infinitely more enduring than their tangible victories ever were. As the embers of the Templars' legend flickered across Europe, the city of Paris was itself undergoing a transformation, one that would leave a permanent mark on the skyline and the imagination of generations to come. For in the 12th century, amid the bustling streets of timber-framed houses, muddy marketplaces, and narrow alleyways crowded with merchants and pilgrims, the foundations of a structure were laid that would redefine what a cathedral could be. Notre-Dame, a Gothic masterpiece whose ambition, scale, and ingenuity would make it one of the most celebrated monuments in history. Unlike the Romanesque churches of earlier centuries, which relied on heavy, fortress-like walls and small windows, the builders of Notre Dame sought to achieve something unprecedented, to create a space that could lift the human spirit, draw the eyes and thoughts heavenward, and flood the interior with light and air, giving form to both faith and aspiration. This was not merely construction, it was an audacious statement of art, devotion, and human ingenuity, where stone and mortar, vision and craftsmanship would converge to create a living cathedral. A place where prayers, processions, and pageantry would echo across centuries. The architects and masons, led initially by Bishop Maurice de Sully, and later joined by generations of artisans whose names have largely faded into history, embarked on a daring experiment, pushing the boundaries of engineering, design, and aesthetic ambition. The choir, the first section to rise, was constructed with soaring vaulted ceilings that seemed to defy gravity, punctuated by lancet windows that allowed sunlight to cascade across the stone floor, illuminating the delicate tracery, sculpted saints, and carved angels that adorned the walls. As work progressed from east to west, each new arch, each flying buttress, each intricately carved gargoyle and grotesque served both practical and symbolic purposes, distributing the immense weight of the stone while simultaneously narrating stories of devotion, morality, and human aspiration. Every detail was a reflection of the era's belief that architecture could be a sermon in stone, that the very structure of a cathedral could instruct, inspire, and elevate the soul without a single word being spoken. Notre Dame was more than a building. It was a statement of cultural ambition, a symbol of Paris's growing prominence, and a testament to the fusion of faith and human ingenuity. As the nave took shape, the transepts expanded into the familiar cruciform layout that would become a defining characteristic of Gothic cathedrals, while the west facade began to rise, monumental and commanding, adorned with rows of sculpted kings, prophets, and angels whose watchful presence would greet every visitor for centuries. To approach Notre Dame was to confront the vastness of human vision, the intersection of the earthly and the divine, and the confidence of a city that sought to leave an indelible mark on history through stone, light, and devotion. The cathedral, still incomplete in many ways, already represented a leap forward, not merely in size or decoration, but in its daring embrace of verticality, transparency, and grandeur. A place where human hands had sought to capture the eternal, and where every stone told a story of ambition, faith, and the limitless possibilities of imagination. As Notre Dame rose from the muddy streets of 12th century Paris, it became not just a cathedral, but a laboratory of architectural daring, where builders and masons pushed the boundaries of what stone, wood, and human ingenuity could achieve, giving birth to innovations that would define Gothic architecture for centuries to come. Among the most revolutionary of these were the flying buttresses, elegant arcs of stone that reached outward from the cathedral's walls, transferring the immense weight of the vaulted ceilings far beyond the interior, allowing the nave to soar to unprecedented heights while freeing the walls for vast, luminous windows that bathed the interior in ethereal light. These buttresses were more than engineering solutions, they were expressions of ambition, a visual testament to a daring vision that sought to lift both stone and spirit skyward, creating a space where humans could feel the divine in the interplay of light and structure, shadow and elevation. Within these soaring walls, the rose windows emerged as jewels of color and craftsmanship, circular mosaics of stained glass that told biblical stories, celebrated saints, and conveyed theological concepts in radiant hues that shifted and danced with the changing light of day. Each rose window was a marvel of geometry and artistry, a fusion of technical skill and spiritual intent, designed to draw the eye upward and the mind inward, inviting worshipers and visitors alike to contemplate mysteries far greater than themselves, while experiencing the emotional power of color, light, and form combined. These windows transformed the cathedral from a mere hall of worship into a luminous narrative, where faith and artistry intertwined, where the stories of Scripture were told not in words but in shimmering glass and meticulously designed stone tracery, captivating the soul as much as the senses. Rising above all else, the spire of Notre-Dame became the ultimate expression of Gothic ambition, a needle-like tower that crowned the intersection of the transept and nave, reaching toward the heavens in both symbol and structure, constructed of oak and clad in lead. The spire was both a technical challenge and a spiritual statement, requiring precision, patience, and the collective genius of generations of craftsmen. It was not merely decorative, it served as a vertical accent that guided the eye and spirit upward, completing the cathedral's dialogue between earth and heaven, body and soul, material and transcendent. Each of these innovations, the flying buttresses that freed walls for light, the rose windows that transformed sunlight into story, and the soaring spire that crowned the cathedral represented a leap forward in both imagination and engineering, a daring rethinking of what a sacred space could be, and an enduring symbol of humanity's capacity to shape the world in pursuit of beauty, devotion, and vision. Through these innovations, Notre Dame became more than a cathedral. It became a statement of possibility, an embodiment of courage and creativity, and a beacon that would inspire countless builders, artists, and dreamers for centuries, a place where stone seemed to breathe, light seemed to sing, and human aspiration reached toward the infinite with every carefully placed arch, pane, and pinnacle. Yet, even the most awe-inspiring creations are not immune to the sweeping tides of human upheaval. In Notre Dame, despite centuries of devotion, artistic triumph, and architectural brilliance, found itself at the mercy of a revolution that sought to upend not only political power, but every symbol of the old order. During the French Revolution, the cathedral, long a centerpiece of royal pageantry and spiritual life, was transformed from a sacred sanctuary into a symbol of oppression in the eyes of revolutionaries. And in this climate of fervent iconoclasm, the bells that had once echoed across Paris to mark royal ceremonies, festive occasions, and the rhythm of daily life were torn from their towers and melted down to serve the insatiable demands of war. While statues of kings, prophets, and saints that had adorned the facade for generations were beheaded, smashed, or defaced, leaving the once proud faces of stone, hollowed and silent. The altars, relics, and sacred treasures that had drawn pilgrims and dignitaries alike were ransacked, hidden, or destroyed, as the cathedral was stripped of both its spiritual authority and its material grandeur, becoming a hollowed shell that reflected the chaos and zeal of a society determined to break with the past. Within these battered walls, the echoes of centuries of prayers, coronations, and ceremonies seemed to linger faintly, ghost-like, as though the spirit of Notre Dame itself resisted erasure, even as the physical manifestations of its glory were violently dismantled. The revolutionaries' fervor, driven by ideology and rage, could not fully erase the cathedral's presence or the collective memory of the Parisians who had grown up beneath its towering arches. And in the desolation of its stripped nave, the cathedral became a stark reminder of both the fragility of human achievement and the resilience of cultural and spiritual legacy. Despite the destruction, the stone bones of Notre Dame endured, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of kings, the ebb and flow of faith, and the enduring capacity of humanity to rebuild, reinterpret, and reimagine the symbols that defined civilization. The desecration of Notre Dame was not simply an act of vandalism or neglect. It was a deliberate statement, an attempt to sever the connection between church, monarchy, and society. And yet, paradoxically, was this very act of destruction that would later underscore the cathedral's importance, inspiring a renewed reverence, restoration efforts, and the eventual resurgence of its status as a symbol of both Paris and the enduring human spirit. In the ruins and echoes of revolutionary fury, Notre Dame's story became one not merely of loss, but of resilience, a testament to the capacity of history to remember, to mourn, and ultimately to reclaim what seemed irrevocably lost. After decades of neglect and the scars of revolutionary desecration, the soul of Notre Dame seemed buried beneath centuries of dust, decay, and the echoing silence of what had once been the beating heart of Parisian spiritual and civic life. Yet, in the 19th century, remarkable resurgence began, driven by visionaries who saw not merely a building in ruins, but a living testament to the ingenuity, devotion, and artistry of generations long past. Among them, Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus emerged as the architects and custodians of revival. Scholars and dreamers who approached restoration not simply as repair, but as resurrection, painstakingly studying every fragment of stone, every surviving sculpture, in every faded drawing to reconstruct the cathedral in a manner that honored its original spirit while reinvigorating it for a new era. They replaced eroded statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, repaired the flying buttresses, and reimagined the spire that had been lost to time, blending historical accuracy with creative insight. And in doing so, they restored not only the cathedral's physical presence, but its symbolic essence, transforming Notre-Dame once again into a beacon of faith, artistry, and national pride. Walking through the restored nave, one could almost hear the whispers of medieval craftsmen in the vaulted ceilings, the prayers of kings and bishops echoing faintly through the rose windows, and the collective heartbeat of centuries of worshippers resonating in the stone and wood, as though the very building had absorbed the devotion, ambition, and imagination of every hand that had touched it. Violeta and Lasses approached their work with meticulous attention to detail, often reconstructing missing elements with creative yet respectful interpretation, aware that every sculpture, every pinnacle, and every carved gargoyle contributed not merely to aesthetic harmony, but to the cathedral's role as a cultural and spiritual symbol, a living chronicle of human aspiration and resilience. Through their efforts, Notre-Dame was returned not only as a functional space of worship, but as a monument to French heritage, a repository of history, legend, and artistry that could inspire awe in the heart of any visitor, whether pilgrim, scholar, or casual admirer, and a reminder that even in the face of destruction and neglect, human vision and dedication have the power to reclaim, restore, and elevate what seemed lost. By the mid-19th century, Notre-Dame once again towered above Paris, its spire piercing the skyline, its rose windows ablaze with color and narrative, and its halls ready to welcome kings, citizens, and pilgrims alike. A triumphant testament to the enduring power of architecture to convey identity, faith, and ambition. The restoration was more than a technical achievement. It was a cultural statement, a declaration that France valued the preservation of memory, artistry, and legacy, and that through the patient and inspired work of dedicated visionaries, the cathedral could continue to serve as a bridge between the past and the present, a symbol of resilience that would stand for generations as both a marvel of human craftsmanship and a guardian of national pride. Across the seas of the South China Sea, where the wind carved waves into towering walls of water and the horizon seemed infinite, a very different kind of power was taking shape, one that had little to do with stone, spire, or crown, yet rivaled the might of kings and empires in ambition, strategy, and sheer audacity. And at the heart of this tempestuous world rose Jung Yi Sao, later immortalized as Qing Shi, a woman whose name would become synonymous with command, cunning, and unyielding authority. She began not as a legendary pirate, but through a marriage alliance that, like many of the era, was intended to consolidate influence and power within the complex networks of maritime factions. Yet it was here, in the shadow of her husband and the seafaring men of the Red Flag Fleet, that Jung Yi Sao's brilliance, decisiveness, and unparalleled sense of leadership began to emerge, transforming her from a partner in marriage into the ultimate arbiter of an empire afloat, commanding hundreds of ships and thousands of men, women, and even children with a precision, discipline, and strategic insight that rivaled any monarch on land. Her ascent was not the result of mere chance or luck, but of an extraordinary ability to recognize both opportunity and vulnerability in the shifting tides of maritime politics, naval warfare, and human ambition, for the seas were as dangerous and treacherous as any throne room, and it required far more than brute strength to unite the fleets, enforce codes, maintain loyalty across a network where disobedience could mean death and betrayal was never far from the horizon. Jung Yi Sao understood the delicate balance between fear and respect, reward and punishment, and she codified these principles into a strict yet pragmatic set of rules that governed every aspect of her fleet. from discipline and loyalty to the treatment of captives and the equitable division of plunder, creating an order so effective that it not only ensured obedience, but elevated her from the role of leader by circumstance to a sovereign in her own right, a maritime queen whose authority was absolute and whose reputation spread like wildfire through ports, towns, and the corridors of power far beyond the waters she dominated. As she assumed control of the Red Flag Fleet, Jung Yi Sao reshaped the very nature of piracy in the region, turning what had often been chaotic, opportunistic bands of marauders into a disciplined, cohesive, and strategically formidable force, feared by the Qing dynasty, respected by European naval powers, and remembered by history as the ultimate embodiment of daring, intellect, and ambition, demonstrating that authority, courage, and vision could exist anywhere, even on the rolling, unpredictable expanse of the open sea, and that a woman, against every expectation and societal constraint, could wield power with as much decisiveness and consequence as any king or general of the era. Once Jung Yi Sao had firmly established herself at the helm of the Red Flag Fleet, she recognized that sheer numbers and firepower alone would never be enough to maintain control over an armada as vast and diverse as hers. For the seas were an unpredictable theater of chaos, where tempers flared as quickly as cannon smoke and loyalty could shift as suddenly as the tides. And so she set about instituting a codified system of rules that would govern every aspect of life aboard her ships. A legal framework as precise and disciplined as any royal court on land, yet forged in the crucible of maritime survival. Her laws were uncompromising. Desertion was punishable by immediate decapitation. Theft from the communal treasury resulted in swift execution, and any pirate who violated the strictures of conduct toward captives or fellow crew members faced brutal, yet predictable consequences, ensuring that fear and respect coexisted in perfect balance, binding the fleet together not only through shared ambition, but through the certainty that order would prevail even in the most chaotic of circumstances. But Jung Yi Sao's code was not merely punitive. It was pragmatic, visionary, and deeply strategic, designed to maximize cohesion, efficiency, loyalty across an armada that stretched across the South China Sea. And it extended beyond matters of discipline to encompass hierarchy, division of loot, and responsibilities during both combat and daily operations, leaving no ambiguity that might invite disorder or rebellion. Within this structure, every sailor knew their place, their duties, and the consequences of failure, transforming a group that could easily have descended into an unruly mob into a formidable, disciplined force capable of coordinating complex maneuvers, forcing blockades, and responding to threats with the precision of a well-drilled army, yet with the flexibility and speed only possible on the high seas. Remarkably, Jung Yi Sao paired these harsh measures with a deep understanding of human nature, offering incentives, rewards, and opportunities for advancement to those who demonstrated skill, courage, or loyalty, and she applied her rules with consistency and impartiality, earning the grudging admiration, unwavering respect, and even affection of those under her command, for they knew that she was fair, decisive, and unyielding in equal measure. Her governance transformed the Red Flag Fleet into a self-sustaining, highly effective organization where survival, success, and obedience were intertwined, and where Jung Yi Sao's authority was absolute, yet rooted in the clarity, structure, and strategic foresight that few leaders of her time and land or at sea could match, proving that power, when exercised with intellect, discipline, and an unshakable vision, could transcend convention, gender, and expectation to create a legacy that would echo far beyond the horizon she ruled. By 1810, after years of commanding the vast Red Flag Fleet, caging in fierce skirmishes with the Qing Navy, fending off opportunistic European forces, and orchestrating the complex logistics of hundreds of ships and thousands of men, women, and children, Jung Yi Sao had not only proven herself as a master strategist, but also as a visionary leader who understood that the ultimate measure of power was not just in the victories won through force, but in the ability to secure outcomes on one's own terms. When the moment came to confront the combined pressure of the Qing dynasty, its Portuguese allies, and British naval contingents, armadas, equipped with superior firepower, yet lacking the unity, local knowledge, and disciplined cohesion of her fleet, Jung Yi Sao executed a maneuver that would cement her legacy, not as a defeated pirate, but as a sovereign of unparalleled acumen and audacity. She negotiated a surrender that was entirely bloodless. With meticulous foresight, she arranged the terms so that every member of her fleet could come ashore without fear of execution, imprisonment, or confiscation of property, presenting over 200 ships and their crews in a ceremonious procession that showcased both her authority and her dignity. Weapons were laid down with formality, not chaos. Discipline was maintained even in surrender, and the Qing authorities, astonished and perhaps grudgingly impressed, accepted the terms that allowed Jung Yi Sao and her followers to retain their wealth, positions, and freedom. In doing so, she transformed what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a triumph of negotiation, control, and foresight, proving that a leader who understands the balance of power can convert potential disaster into enduring advantage. Jung Yi Sao herself emerged from this historic surrender not diminished but elevated, retiring as a free woman, untarnished by the bloodshed that had so often defined the lives of those who sailed the same waters, commanding the respect of emperors, rival navies, and historians alike. Her retirement was not a retreat into obscurity, but a testament to her unmatched skill, courage, and strategic brilliance, demonstrating that authority and influence are not always measured by continued conflict, but by the wisdom to recognize when and how to secure one's legacy with elegance, precision, and foresight. Even in an era when women were largely barred from positions of formal power, Jung Yi Sao's story stands as a singular example of leadership, showing that intelligence, discipline, and audacity can carve freedom, wealth, and historical immortality out of circumstances where others might see only risk, danger, and limitation. After decades of commanding one of the most formidable fleets in maritime history, orchestrating victories and enforcing discipline with unmatched authority, and negotiating a surrender that secured freedom and wealth for thousands of her followers, Jung Yi Sao, known to many as Qing Shi, gradually withdrew from the tumultuous currents of naval warfare. Yet her presence and influence continued to resonate across the South China Sea, where sailors, merchants, and rival powers alike had learned to measure ambition, courage, and strategy against the standard she had set. In the years following her retirement, she lived out her life away from the chaos of battle, serving the world she had once ruled with a mixture of pride and quiet command. Her reputation as a tactician, leader, and innovator growing even as she chose a path of peace over conflict, demonstrating that power is not solely expressed through force, but through the enduring respect, loyalty, and fear it inspires. In 1844, at the age of 69, Jung Yi Sao passed away peacefully, leaving behind a legacy that was remarkable, not only for its audacity and skill, but for the way she redefined leadership in a world that often refused to acknowledge women as sovereign authorities. Her story, though often overshadowed by Western pirate myths and the biases of historical record-keeping, endured through the oral histories of sailors, the chronicles of regional powers, and the awe inspired in all who heard of the Red Flag Fleet's discipline and reach, securing her place as one of the most powerful and influential female pirates in history. A figure whose life challenged assumptions, shattered conventions, and demonstrated that courage, intelligence, strategic vision can carve a path to authority and immortality even in the most unlikely arenas. Jung Yi Sao's legend serves as a testament not only to her personal brilliance, but to the broader truth that history often forgets the magnitude of those who defy expectation. Yet the stories of such individuals persist, whispered across oceans and centuries, reminding us that leadership, innovation, and influence can emerge from the most unexpected circumstances, and that the mark of a true leader is measured not solely by conquest, but by the enduring impact of their decisions, the loyalty they inspire, and the boundaries they redefine in shaping the world around them. Even as empires rose and fell in centuries past, her name remained etched into the memory of history as a symbol of unyielding authority, audacious courage, and the indomitable spirit of a woman who ruled the seas with unmatched skill and wisdom, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate, inspire, and challenge our understanding of what it means to wield power. Despite the monumental impact Jung Yi Sao had on maritime history, her story, like those of many extraordinary women throughout history, was largely obscured in mainstream narratives, diminished by the twin forces of gender bias and colonial historiography that often prioritized the exploits of European male figures while overlooking or marginalizing equally remarkable leaders who operated outside those spheres of influence. Historians and chroniclers of the time frequently dismissed her achievements as anomalies, portraying her merely as a curiosity or a footnote in the annals of piracy, rather than recognizing the breadth of her strategic genius, the sophistication of her governance, and the unprecedented scale of her command over one of the largest pirate confederations in history. Yet, even as official records failed to fully capture her legacy, whispers of her deeds persisted across the oceans. Through the stories of those who sailed under her command, through the cautionary tales shared by rival fleets, and through the enduring fascination she inspired in later generations, creating a legend that could not be extinguished, no matter how systematically her accomplishments were ignored or minimized. The erasure of Jung Yi Sao from conventional histories underscores a broader truth about the forces that shape our understanding of the past. Power, influence, and innovation are not always documented or celebrated equitably. The contributions of women, colonized peoples, and those outside dominant cultural narratives are often left in the shadows, their stories waiting to be rediscovered, reinterpreted, and celebrated. And yet, in the case of Jung Yi Sao, the magnitude of her leadership, the discipline of her fleet, and the extraordinary intelligence and courage she demonstrated were so profound that they refused to fade entirely, persisting in folklore, maritime tradition, and the modern imagination as a symbol of audacious authority, strategic brilliance, and resilience against the tides of societal expectation. Her legend reminds us that history is not only a record of what was written in official chronicles, but also a tapestry of influence, memory, and inspiration, and that the true measure of her greatness lies not in how widely she was recognized in her own time, but in how her story continues to resonate, captivate, and challenge our understanding of what is possible, even centuries after her death. Jung Yi Sao's enduring legacy, therefore, is not merely as a pirate queen who conquered the seas, but as a paradigm of leadership, vision, and empowerment, demonstrating that courage, intellect, and unwavering authority can carve a place in history that defies conventional narratives, leaving a mark that outlasts prejudice, omission, and the passing of generations, and ensuring that, even when history attempts to forget, legends like hers remain unyielding, vibrant, and profoundly instructive for all who take the time to look beyond the surface of the records and discover the full measure of her extraordinary life. As we reflect on the lives of these scandalous monarchs, it becomes clear that power in the medieval and early modern world was a double-edged sword, granting kings the ability to shape kingdoms and destinies, yet exposing them to the temptations and pitfalls that so often accompanied absolute authority. King John of England, for instance, left a realm fractured by mistrust, rebellion, and whispers of illegitimate heirs. His reign remembered less for triumphs and more for turmoil. A stark reminder that leadership is measured not merely by titles, but by the stability and trust a ruler inspires among their subjects. Charles VI of France, dubbed the Mad, serves as another cautionary tale. where mental illness intertwined with royal scandal and political chaos, producing a reign that bewildered allies, emboldened enemies, and forced the court to navigate the unpredictable whims of a king whose mind sometimes wandered far from the demands of governance. In Castile, Peter the Cruel displayed a ruthless fusion of passion and brutality, a ruler whose violent impulses extended from political strategy to personal relationships, illustrating how the personal and political were inseparably entwined in the lives of monarchs who wielded both sword and authority. Meanwhile, Edward II of England's legacy was marred not only by military defeat at Bannockburn, but by the scandal of favoritism toward male companions, vulnerability that rendered him both politically weak and the subject of persistent intrigue. Wenceslas of Bohemia, notorious more for public drunkenness, acts of nudity, and palace brawls than any tangible governance, reminds us that monarchy was often performative and that appearances and spectacle could overshadow responsibility. Henry VIII of England, whose 6 marriages and dramatic break with Rome are legendary, embodied the tension between cultural patronage and personal chaos, commissioning works of art and architecture, even as court life became a theater of desire, intrigue, and sudden reversals of fortune. Francis I of France, celebrated as a Renaissance patron, similarly transformed his court into a stage where romance and politics danced hand in hand, reinforcing the idea that monarchs were often as concerned with spectacle and personal indulgence as with matters of state. Across Europe, rulers like Alonso, Charles II, and Ferdinand manipulated courtly intrigue, secret corridors, and the lives of mistresses and illegitimate children to consolidate power, testament to the human complexities underlying titles and crowns. Beyond the courts of kings, the story of the Knights Templar reveals another facet of power, wealth, secrecy, and influence that could rival even monarchs themselves. Founded with the papal blessing to protect pilgrims, they evolved into a network both feared and admired, their independence and the debts owed to them provoking the envy and fear of kings, culminating in the mass arrests of October 13, 1307, and the dissolution of their order by 1312, though their leaders were executed and their organization erased from political power. Their legacy endured, transforming into legend, myth, and inspiration for generations, fascinated by their combination of martial skill, religious devotion, and enigmatic authority. In parallel, the story of Notre-Dame Cathedral stands as a monument to human creativity and resilience. Beginning in 12th century Paris, it represented a Gothic architectural revolution, introducing innovations like flying buttresses, rose windows, and the soaring spire, a symbol of spiritual and cultural ambition. Though desecrated during the French Revolution, bells melted. Statues destroyed. It was restored in the 19th century by Viollet-le-Duc and Lasses, reclaiming its place as a beacon of French heritage and demonstrating that beauty, vision, and history can endure even through periods of destruction and neglect. Finally, the saga of Jung Yi Sao, known to history as Qing Shi, embodies the triumph of intellect, discipline, and strategy over circumstance. Rising from a marriage alliance to command the legendary Red Flag Fleet, she instituted strict pirate laws, enforcing loyalty and discipline with remarkable fairness and authority. In 1810, she negotiated a surrender so calculated that it was entirely bloodless, securing freedom, wealth, and safety for thousands, retiring peacefully to live until 1844. Despite being largely erased from mainstream history due to gender and colonial bias, her legend survives, a reminder that courage, intelligence, and audacity can carve a legacy that transcends time, borders, and the limitations imposed by others. When we look across these lives, monarchs consumed by power, orders dissolved by politics, cathedrals restored against all odds, and pirates who commanded empires of the sea, becomes clear that history is shaped as much by human ambition, ingenuity, and resilience as by official chronicles and decrees. It teaches us that leadership, Courage and vision can manifest in ways both glorious and scandalous. That legacies are crafted as much by daring and defiance as by obedience, and that even the most remarkable stories can be lost, only to resurface through curiosity, scholarship, and imagination. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into dreams, let these tales of ambition, audacity, and enduring influence remind you that history is never truly gone yet, waits for those willing to see beyond the surface, to uncover the lessons, the dramas, and the triumphs that continue to resonate centuries later. Sleep well and let your imagination sail across the kingdoms, seas, and cathedrals of the past.